So this week's cooldown question comes from our audience. Yay! Keep those cards and letters and questions coming in all the various social media forms except for cards and letters. Although we'll probably take cards and letters too if you even know what those are.
Yeah, we'll have to get a P.O. box or something for that.
Yeah.
I don't want to give out your home address. Have too many screaming fans on your doorstep.
Yep. Anyway, Elise asks, I hear you talk all the time about FKTs. What is an FKT? How do you get into them, and how are they governed?
Good question. So thanks, Elise, for the question, first of all. So I guess to kind of start with the basics of like, what is an FKT? So FKT stands for fastest known time. And originally the idea of FKTs and the whole kind of FKT movement was very just word of mouth. It was literally like, hey, I want to go on the Polichasky Trail. What's the fastest time that you know of? What's the FKT? Like, and it was just, you know, you asked your friends, you asked your other running buddies, and it would just kind of travel by word of mouth. And with the rise of the internet, I would say like probably early to mid 2000s, people started to actually keep track of this stuff. This was way before Strava, any of that stuff. It was all, honestly, mostly I would say honor system. It was just kind of like, hey, I ran up Polichasky in an hour today. Has anyone run faster than that? Oh, no, cool. I guess I'll claim that. And then until someone else says they go out and did it faster, that's going to be the FKT. And that's how it was for a long time. And there were these two guys, Peter Bakken and Buzz Burrell. And they actually developed a website. Originally, it was like just an old school web forum. And then it became its own site, which is fastestknowntime.org. And that's kind of when I came into the FKT scene, full disclosure, that was probably like 2018 or 19. I kind of first started hearing about it and thinking about it. That it was already its own website and it had its own guidelines and submission rules. And by that time you had this huge proliferation of GPS watches and Strava and Garmin Connect and all these other softwares where you could really actually prove these things. So it kind of went from being honor system to, okay, here, these two guys kind of created this database and this website and this form of guidelines that the whole community just kind of said, okay, sure, we trust you guys. And for what it's worth, they were some of like the OGs in the FKT scene. They were doing, you know, speed runs on John Muir Trail and Aconcagua and stuff like that, like way back in the day. And now it's like, yeah, we all just kind of agreed by accepting this website as the place that, okay, these are the rules we're going to follow. And this is the procedure for, you know, how we're going to submit stuff.
So so that's the basics. And fastest known time, there's a website that has rules and keeps track of the records. So how are FKTs officially tracked and verified? So when you're trying to do, like you just did an FKT on Polichasky, yep. So what's the process when you're planning to do one of these?
So I'll give a big full disclosure, which is I am a regional editor for the fastest known time website, which means that any FKTs that get submitted in my region, which is Latin America, they go through me, which sounds like a conflict of interest, which it is, which is why any FKT that I submit actually goes to a whole other team of people and they have to review it. And that's the same. I think there's like a dozen or maybe even 20 of us regional editors who all manage kind of different parts of the world. It's all volunteer based and we do it because we love this idea and concept. And the idea is any of those people, if they, you know, most of us are athletes in the space, that's how we got involved with it. And if we are submitting an FKT, it goes to the rest of the team. Someone else has to verify it. We can't verify our own FKTs. That's pretty, hopefully obvious. So the way that if you're interested in looking at an FKT and setting an FKT is you would go to fastestknowntime.org. You would click through, find the route you want to look at, figure out what the time is that you're going to get. And then, you know, there's kind of courtesy out, like if it's a really competitive route, sometimes it's appropriate to like, if there's a comment section, you could say, hey, I'm Ty and I'm going to try and set the, whatever it is, the, you know, Cotopaxi FKT next Wednesday or something. Or most of it is honestly just done after the fact. And the way that works is you go to submit an FKT and you have to have some kind of proof. And this is where the guidelines come in. So almost everybody who submits an FKT to me, in my region in South America, they're submitting either a public Strava link or a public Garmin Connect link. Those are by far the two most common ones. Every once in a while, we have something weird where it's like, oh, I don't have a GPS watch, but I have like, you know, a metadated photo here at the beginning and here on the summit, and you can do the math. And like, that's a little bit clunkier. And if it's a really competitive route, then maybe that has an asterisk next to it or something. But in general, it's everything for verification purposes is done with actual GPS tracks. That's how it's done nowadays. And there has been a lot of controversy over the last, like, I don't know, 10 or 15 years where you have some very high profile athletes who have claimed times, especially in like, let's say the 2010s, kind of before GPS watches were as good as they were now, where they said, oh, my watch died halfway through, and they just claimed the time. And it's been kind of accepted as lore for a long time. But now with today's standards, looking back at it, people are like, oh, I don't know if you actually did that. So it's like kind of a mess, honestly. But nowadays, I feel like it's pretty straightforward. It's like, you know, GPS watches are not prohibitively expensive for most people. You can use your phone. Like, you don't even need a GPS watch. You can use like the Strava or Garmin app on your phone, and just use that as a tracker. If you're going like to an 8,000 meter mountain, for example, like probably want to bring 2 or 3 devices, because guess what? Like, it gets really cold and those things die. So you're going to want to have some backups, or maybe even bring a little, what do you call it? Tiny power bank or something. So long story short, the burden of proof is on the person submitting the FKT. And if you don't have enough to satisfy, you know, the regional editor, who in theory that regional editor is, you know, beholden to the overall FKT community, then that's a problem. So,
Okay.
so that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Okay. Great. So technology helps out a lot here, in the advances in technology and GPS in particular.
Yeah. It sure
Okay.
does.
All right. So you now hold, according to my research, 85. Does that include Polichowski FKTs?
Probably not. Yeah. Probably not.
Maybe
Probably
86 then. So what draws you to this format compared to traditional road races and ultra races?
I mean, I love doing both of those things. I love racing. Like, there's nothing like the feeling of just like nerves and energy of like being on a start line with like, you know, a lot of other really fit competitive people. Like, that is the coolest thing in the whole world. And pushing against people in a race is one of the coolest things in the whole world. So I love racing. I will say that off the bat, and I will never stop running races. I think there's 2 things that I really like about FKTs. One is it has allowed me to really develop a super specialized niche as an athlete, which is like really big, high altitude mountain speed records. You know, I think if I were forced to compete only in trail running or only in the marathon, I probably, like, definitely if I were still competing in the marathon, like, I would probably have retired a long time ago, because I would have just been like, okay, here's my ceiling. Like, I figured it out. That was like my motivation for a long time, and it's not good enough to be competitive and make a living at. So I'm going to go be an engineer now, you know? But because this space existed, like, I kind of like, you know, wound my way for many years through ultra running and trail running into mountain running, and then into this world of like big mountain FKTs, and really found my stride here in just the last few years, I would say, in the Himalaya. And so it's just, that's the thing that is exciting me right now, is moving really quickly in really big mountains. I think it's really, really fascinating as a puzzle of how to prepare for those things and how to execute on those days. And that, I just love that. I love the puzzle of it. And then I think the whole other side is, I am a control freak, like we talked about earlier on this episode, and I like to control the things I can control. And part of that is really nice about FKTs, we literally just talked about this, is, hey, if you're going to go for an FKT on Cotopaxi and there's 3 feet of fresh snow, guess what? You should probably reschedule that. And that's what we did. And then I went to then I went to Polichowski and had a great day there. And maybe I'll go to Cotopaxi in a few weeks, or maybe I just won't. And that's okay. But it allows you to have so much more control over your performance, just by means of being able to decide the specifics of the like quote unquote competition itself. You know, you can compete today, you can compete tomorrow, or you can compete 2 weeks from now, and you can pick the absolute best time. And it goes back to like the kind of engineer brain, I think, of it's all a big puzzle to me. And I find that part fascinating, is, okay, you know, even with with Manaslu last year. Okay, do I go super early in the season? Do I go late in the season? Do I leave first thing in the morning? Do I do the whole thing overnight? There's all these different pieces of it that where if it's a race, everybody just shows up on the starting line at 6 a.m. and the gun goes off and you all run. So it just adds another layer of complexity that I think is really interesting. And then I guess the last thing I will add, I know I said two, but this third one I think is actually also really cool and important, is you kind of have this with like world records and, course records in traditional racing, but FKTs, you're always competing against like everyone who's ever run on that route, right? So, I can compete with Kilian Jornet and Carl Egloff and Jim Walmsley and these other guys who I have tremendous respect for without us all literally being on the start line at the same time. And not only does it just give me the opportunity to compete against those guys, but it's like, hey, I get to compete against Carl on his best day ever. Like if we're in a race, it's like, oh, I had the flu, I didn't do that well. You can always make an excuse, but it's like, well, if this was your record, this is your best day ever, like you can't really say anything about that. It's like, so if you have the FKT, it's like you're competing with this like avatar of this person, from sometimes like 20, 30 years ago, which I think is super cool, even across generational lines of looking at, I'm trying to break a record that was set before I was born or something. And I think that's just fascinating and really exciting.
That's super cool. Yeah, I hadn't thought about it. So you've got both the longitudinal, you're competing with everybody who's ever run the race, and you have the flexibility to do it. I mean, I wouldn't say it's everybody's perfect day, because especially as I know now from you being in the Himalayas a few times, it's a pretty short window. So you have a few chances, and you do get to choose your day, but you don't get an infinite number of days.
So it's not their perfect day, but it's the best they could ever do.
Right.
It's
That's
like, so
a
if
good
you
way
take,
to put it.
like if you take UTMB, for example, you could say, oh, like, when Jim Walmsley won, oh, but like Francois Dehaene, he's won UTMB a bunch of times, he wasn't in the race that year. So would he have won if Francois had been there? Well, it's like, well, you can't, with an FKT, it's like, well, here's Francois's best time, here's Jim's best time, here's Kilian's best time. Like, you have all these people lined up and you can say, it is like, it's kind of like the world record in the marathon or something.
Right. And since you've been in these marathons and ultra marathons, I have come to know them. And it is one of the difficulties is, I remember, for instance, the Olympic trials, the U.S. Olympic trials in Los Angeles. And it was like 90 degrees that day.
It was warm.
But they got to run them. It's the only day they planned it for months and months. So you're going to run it, but it's 90 degrees, and it just killed everybody. I mean, everybody was there. People were just falling like flies everywhere. And even the winners, sort of struggled across the finish line, which is a very different race. You say, wow, if it was 50 instead of 90, would
probably have a different team.
Different team, different race, different team.
Yep.
So. And that's just one more factor. Everybody's got the same factors they have to face, and that's just the way it is. So it's an interesting concept.
I, again, for what it's worth, like both as a competitor and a fan, I think that makes racing fascinating, because you get, for example, I think it was it 2016 Boston Marathon, maybe 2018 Boston Marathon, the year where it was like 37 degrees and driving sleet and headwind the whole way, and you had Des Linden, who's an American woman, and Yuki Kawauchi, who's a Japanese man, won the races. And, would those two have won the Boston Marathon if they weren't running those conditions? Like, those two people are known for being tremendously tough runners, like really gritty and like good at dealing with hard conditions, slow conditions. They're not the fastest runners in the field. If it's a 2:03 race, they're not going to win the race on the men's side. 2:03 men's time, they're not going to win that race. But when it's when the race is literally 10 or 20 minutes slower than normal because of the conditions, suddenly it just opens it up, and like anyone in the elite field has a shot, and it just completely changes the dynamic. So I think especially as a spectator, like I remember watching that from the comfort of my own home and being like, this is awesome. This is really cool to watch. I would not have wanted to be in that race myself. It looked miserable. But again, it's like, I probably would have done better than I would have done if it were a perfectly clear day in a race like that, because I'm not going to go run 2:03 or even 2:08. But I can probably gut out something harder on a tough day than a lot of, the, elite guys who are training in Southern California or Arizona or something, and
Yep.
might not be used to the old New England spring.
Yeah. Okay. So one last question I have for you that I've always been curious about since I've learned about this stuff is, so how do you know what's an FKT? What routes are in the FKTs? And suppose you just decide you have some really cool route and you want to create an FKT. How does that all work?
So the first part of the question is the easier one. If you just go to fastestknowntime.org, and you just click on routes, it has a giant world map, and you can zoom in, and it has little dots, and you can see everything. So you could like literally zoom into your state or your neighborhood even and see if there's routes around your house or in your state or whatever. Then, or I think there's also a search function. You can search by country or anything like that. So I actually will use this a lot if I'm traveling. For example, if I have, if I'm going to Japan on the way home from Nepal, which I did last year, and I'm going to a new part of the country, and I just want to do, like, not even for an FKT, but I just want to look for a cool route to go run or hike by myself, I will look at the FKT map and just look around and be like, oh, and some of them are like 1,000 miles and some of them are like 2 miles. So there's like a huge range. And I think there is a filter function, so you can really get into the weeds there. But it can be really helpful, like whether you're looking to actually try and go set an FKT or you're just looking for a cool running route, or hiking route or anything like that. So that's my first, is just go check out the routes page. And then the question about submitting FKT is a really good one. So basically, again, this is part of my work as a regional editor. So I approve of incoming FKT submissions, meaning people who are setting a new FKT. And then I also approve of incoming route submissions. And honestly, it is tremendously subjective. Basically, FKTs are not supposed to be Strava segments. So Strava segment, Mr. C, I don't know how much you know about Strava, but anyone can make any Strava segment anywhere, which means like I could make a Strava segment on my street that's 100 meters long, and it's like the last 100 meters back to my house, and I could name it that, and I could make it private or public, but like it's completely user generated. And so, for example, like, if you go to the Metropolitan Park, the big park right here next to my house, there are like 500 segments. It's a complete mess. It's a disaster. But like there's nothing you can do about that. You just, like you'll do a run in there and it'll be like, you hit 800 segments on this run or something, and it's just because people will make a segment literally for like from this tree to that post and like up this tiny hill and like running down the stairs. And it's like, okay, so I think the big thing is like FKT doesn't want to devolve into Strava segments. So I'd say there's 3 really important things that you have to meet, at least probably 1, ideally 2 of those for me to approve your route. One is if it has some history of being really competitive. So if it's already a route that people are doing a lot and it has a competitive history and you explain that in the route description, great, that's awesome. The other would be if it is has like a really obvious aesthetic that makes sense. So for example, like sea to summit on Mount Fuji. That was one where when it got submitted, it was already on the site when I did it, but that's a really cool aesthetic line. Going running from the ocean to the top of the tallest mountain in your country, that's really cool. We'll submit that, or we'll approve that, even if it's not necessarily like already a competitive route. And the third one, maybe there were only 2 things I was thinking about. Yeah, I think that's it actually. It's basically aesthetics and history / competition.
Okay.
Yeah, those are the important things.
The answer right from the source, the man who is right in the middle of approving FKT, so knows what he talks about. So
yeah,
thanks
and,
for your...
And there is a lot of like discussion amongst like us all as regional editors, as well as, we will put it to the community sometimes and say like, hey, does this look like something that should be approved or not? Or sometimes there'll be a back and forth between the person submitting, like they'll submit and I'll be like, why should this be a route? Like you didn't really give a good explanation. And then they'll be like, oh, it's this really cool thing. Like there's all this history on it. Okay, well, that's great. So sometimes there's a little bit of back and forth, but usually it's pretty obvious. Usually it's either like, hey, here's this cool route that I hiked with my buddy. And it's like, okay, cool. But like, that's probably not FKT worthy. And then sometimes it's like, oh, this is super cool, mountain climb or aesthetic line across a park or something like that. Or a very competitive thing. And it makes sense.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. And we hope, Elise, this answered your question and provides some value to the community. And take us out.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you guys for listening, watching, reading for another week with us. Please send us any feedback, questions, comments, concerns, hopes, dreams, all the usual. You can send that to me, ty@chosky.run, or DM me on Instagram. Remember, you can read all of my raw training logs on my blog if you prefer a written version, and get that delivered to your email via Substack at tylercandrews.substack.com. Ty's Training is a Chosky Media production brought to you by Chosky Endurance Collective, the world's leader in online coaching, travel, and community for endurance athletes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you guys next week. Ciao.